Hello, we continue today studying in the Gospel of Mark. Today we pick up in chapter 10 and verse 35. It says in verse 35, "And James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to him saying, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.' And he said to them, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And they said to him, 'Grant that we may sit in your glory, one on your right and one on your left.' And Jesus said to them, 'You do not know what you're asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized?' And they said to him, 'We are able.' And Jesus said to them, 'The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared.' And hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. And calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, 'You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many.'" Jesus, you'll remember, in our previous study, had just been speaking about, again, what would soon come as he goes to face what he's going to face in Jerusalem. There he has explained that he will be mocked, and he will be spit upon, he will be scourged, he will be killed, and then he'll be raised from the dead. When you think about that, it really makes this request at this time seem all the more surprising and inconsiderate and really just out of place. When James and John are looking for positions of preeminence and glory. And yet, we ought to look at it from more than just our perspective in our time. We remember that these men are not fully understanding at this time about everything that's going on and what the kingdom is about. They're still learning those things. They won't completely understand it till after the death and resurrection of Jesus. They can't grasp at this time that the Son of God, with his power, that he really is going to die. They just cannot fathom that idea. They think, no doubt, with his power, somehow he's going to avert this. They show faith, even though it's misguided. They just don't understand and comprehend properly that this is God's purpose, not for this to be averted, but for this to be done, and that he will overcome it, but he's not going to go around it. He's going to meet it head on, and he's going to die, and he's going to overcome it through the resurrection. But they're still not understanding this. But in their request, there is at least something, I think, to consider and even admire. When you look at it from their perspective, they are expressing faith even though it's misguided. They believe that Jesus is going to reign in his kingdom. And they're looking, or they wouldn't be looking for positions in that kingdom. He had warned them about sacrifice and persecutions that they would face as a disciple. But he'd also assured them of great rewards. He had spoken not only of his death, but he had spoken of the glorious kingdom that was soon to come. And so they believed, even though they misunderstood many things. But of course, on the other hand, their request does not only reveal misconceptions, but it reveals pride and jealousy and their immaturity in asking such a thing. We especially see that immaturity in Matthew's account. In Matthew chapter 20 and verse 20, we see that they have their mother to come and make this request on their behalf. Jesus here, in gentleness, rebukes them. And he reminds them that with what they're asking, to sharing his glory would mean that they would have to drink the cup which he was drinking and endure the baptism that he was going to be baptized with. And to talk about drinking the cup with him, and he's not talking about literally drinking of a cup, but he's talking about a sharing in what he's going to be participating in. and that's suffering. Are they able to drink the cup of suffering that he's going to drink? When he talks about baptism, when we hear the word baptism, the word baptizo would be rightly translated immersion. And he's asking them, are you willing to be immersed in this immersion of suffering that I'm going to be immersed in? And when he asks them this, they say in verse 39, we are able. And they would be. But at this time they don't realize what all that involves. Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I will be baptized. There are many things they don't understand at this point, which is the reason they make such a request. But their faith at this point is immature, yet it will grow, and they will suffer. They will drink of this cup, and they will be baptized with this suffering. And their faith will grow to the point that will enable them to do that faithfully. And James would be the first to die. He would be beheaded by Herod. Jesus explains that these positions of honor that they're asking for, however, are not secured by influence, but by the Father to those who have met the qualifications that he has prepared. He might be close to these men, and he was. You remember it's Peter, James, and John that are part of this inner circle. They seem to be the closest. They've been following the longest. But just because he's close to them and maybe even attached to these two disciples, he can bestow upon them any single favor that didn't follow the regular course of things. Verse 41, it says, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. And when they hear this request, they're filled with indignation. We ought not think that this is righteous indignation here. I think they're jealous and they're upset. Simply because James and John had spoken up and asked for what they themselves wanted to ask for. Well, there's lessons to learn even for us in that. I think, again, we ought not be so critical of these men, because I think sometimes when we really examine ourselves, we find that many times we're tempted to be the most indignant at the faults of others, which we ourselves are guilty of. We can be the same way. But we see that Jesus doesn't just verbally rebuke the disciples, but he takes the occasion to teach them, again, concerning true greatness, which in these words does rebuke them. And rebukes us to cause us to really think about what we see as true greatness. He makes a contrast between the standards of the world and the standards of those who truly follow him as disciples. The things of the world, the standards of the world, the way the world looks at things are something that's always a temptation for the disciples of Jesus to follow, rather than to look at things like we ought to look at them. Among the Gentiles, that is, among the world, those who are recognized as leaders and those who are recognized as great are those who rule over others and are served by others. But it's not so among the followers of Christ, he says. It's not that way. The kingdom of Christ is different than the kingdom of men. The ways of those in the kingdom of Christ is different from those in the kingdoms of men. The kingdom of Christ and its citizens are just different from the world. And those who are great in the kingdom of Christ are not those who are served, but rather they are those who serve the most. That's who's the greatest. He says, you know, that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great men exercise authority lord over them. The ones who are the greatest positions are the ones who are served the most. But he says it's not that way among you. Verse 43, he said, whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. The one who serves the most is the greatest. He says, if you wish to be first, you shall become a slave of all. You know, service is the great law of greatness in the kingdom of Christ. Now, it seems paradoxical to the world. The world sees this as backwards. But in the kingdom of Christ, it's not the way it is in the way of the world. It's not based upon worldly thoughts or worldly actions. No, in the kingdom of Christ, the way to go up is to go down. The way to live is to die. The way to be first is to be last. And the way to be great is to serve, to be a servant. In fact, to be a slave of all. And the king of this heavenly kingdom is not exempt from the law of greatness. In fact, he is the greatest of all because he served to the greatest capacity. He humbled himself even to the point of death, even the death on the cross, having come from all the glory of heaven to do that. He's given his all for all of us. And as he said there in verse 45, he said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. He paid the price for us when we couldn't pay it. He didn't come for his own glory. Jesus didn't come because he had to. He came because we needed him to. And he left the glories of heaven. As Paul tells us in Philippians 2, even though he existed in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. It wasn't something he held on to. He could have. But he humbly gave himself freely to come and to die for us, even the death on the cross, to give his life a ransom, a payment, to buy us back, to redeem us, so that we could have salvation. As we mentioned in the beginning of our studies, this verse here, Mark chapter 10 and verse 45, really is a summation of the whole Gospel of Mark. The first 10 chapters deals with the ministry and service of Jesus. And then the chapters that remain, we see him giving his life a ransom for many as he goes to Jerusalem and faces death on the cross. But that was his motivation. The motivation for service was the love that he had. The reason he came was not for himself, but for his love for us. That's why he served. You know, you won't serve whom you don't love. But if you love, and as Jesus said, if you love your enemies, you'll serve them. That's unconditional love. That's not just, well, reciprocal love. I'll love you if you love me back. No, it's agape. It's active goodwill toward man. That's love. And its action, its service is based upon that love. And Jesus said that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. And therefore his service, what he did, was based on his love for us. And he tells us that's what we're to do. If we want to be greatest in the kingdom, that we have to love and we have to serve. And Jesus has shown that in the greatest capacity. I'm reminded of Romans chapter 5 and in verse 8 when he says, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. It's a lot for us to think about. Thinking about if we want to be great, you want to be great in the eyes of God, you want to be great in the kingdom, then ask yourself, how much are you serving? That's a hard question to ask, isn't it? There's none of us that can serve enough. And if we want to be truly great in the eyes of God, it's not about being served by others and wearing titles and being glorified in the eyes of men. No, it's about serving. The greatest is the one who serves the most. That's what Jesus is saying. Important lessons for us. We'll pick up there next time. It's just before Jesus goes into Jerusalem with the healing of blind Bartimaeus. we'll pick up there next time. I hope you'll join us. Until then, I hope you have a good day.